I've been asked to first very briefly say a word on evolutionary economics. I will then turn to the European problem. That takes a little bit of time because I have to explain to you what's going on there. And then I will enter into this aspect to applying thinking about human behavior to these current problems. Now, evolutionary biology suggests that we have innate elements in our basic behavior, that we share as much as we share 2 ears, a nose, 2 eyes, etc. This working hypothesis has been fruitfully applied for explaining human decision-making within the approach of evolutionary psychology. It has been successfully applied to human social behavior in evolutionary anthropology. It has not so been applied in economics, however, nor even in evolutionary economics. Now, the term evolutionary economics suggests that there must be some similarity, but the similarity is at a different level. Evolutionary economics is no coherent body of research. It is a mixed bag, to say the least. The association that a normal economist has if he or she hears of evolutionary economics is an analogy construction, where there is an analogy drawn between natural selection and industrial competition. So it is not evolutionary in the sense as the other two mentioned disciplines here, evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology. The evolutionary contingencies of economic behavior still need to be recognized in economics and also in evolutionary economics. Before that, however, as I mentioned, I have to introduce you the European prerequisites. The European puzzle is, of course, that we have so many cultural commonalities among us: religion, values, the enlightened worldview. Nonetheless, we have an endless history of military conflicts within Europe, very cruel ones. The last one, this is a picture from Hamburg in 1944 after an air raid, was so cruel that in fact there was a morally motivated turnaround after the Second World War to stop this kind of incessant warfare by pushing for some unification, that is, forming a collective of cooperative states in Europe. Basically to prevent what has been disastrous before, namely the fractioning, the forming of coalitions against each other. And this collective of national states should act as a mediator in case of bilateral conflicts between single states. This idea was given a utilitarian backing in terms of free movement of citizens, economic integration, that is free markets and free market entry, and harmonization of regulations. That gave a big push to the economic development after the war. The political equivalent of this utilitarian basis kept a national veto right for each of the involved states or nations, so that they would not be made worse off in terms of their power or income situation by being overruled by the majority. Europe as a collective of nation states is of course only a minimal form of unification, even though it was highly successful in terms of what it wanted to accomplish, namely a peaceful Europe. It was not enough for many of the politicians who wanted in their political ambition to have more, namely a unionist concept of Europe. Not only collection of national states, but a union state. This was symbolically realized in 1979 with the European Parliament. However, this Parliament had only very minimal competences. Why? Well, I guess it was the fear that the nation states would lose their national veto rights against income transfers and other violations of national interests if you would give the parliament the majority voting write on these affairs, particularly on a European budget. These are the members of the European Community. As you can see, the highest per capita GDP, gross domestic product, in 2011 was held by the Netherlands. It's set equal to 100, so that you see the share of each of the countries here. And if you go down the ladder from the Netherlands to Romania and Bulgaria, you find that these have 1/3 of the per capita income of the highest income level. So there is an enormous disparity in income in the European Community. And whenever you have that, there is in democracies with majority voting a pressure to redistribute. Why? Because here is the total population in the European Community. Here is the per capita income. So it goes down from the Netherlands down here all the way to Bulgaria. And if you take a majority voting, that means 50% or 51% of the votes decide what happens. Then, this is the median voter, exactly 50%. You see that the left side here would attract a lot of, or drain a lot of income from the right-hand side by majority voting. Now that's the background of the attempt of the richer countries on the right-hand side to prevent majority voting. However, there was political unionist desire, and instead of introducing it in the parliament, the idea was then after the German unification, which meant to create a legal tender that is shared by our European countries. It was an act of political voluntarism. It deliberately ignored a very basic economic fact, namely that a common currency eliminates the possibility of an economic alignment between member states when they develop differently. If the more competitive countries prosper and the less competitive ones don't do so, they have an exchange rate alignment. So the less competitive ones devalue and make their services and goods more attractive by lowering the price by devaluation, while the more competitive ones do the opposite. This alignment was no longer available with the common currency. And that meant that if you devalue, say in Greece, because the Greek economy is not competitive enough to keep up with the German or the Swiss economy, the internal prices and income relations in Greece will not be affected except the import prices. But more basically everything is left intact, no battles of redistribution about income, etc. If you take away this way of aligning differences in competitiveness that develop over time, you must adjust the prices and the income relations in the country. That is, in Greece now the prices have to be put down, income has to be lowered, and that hurts enormously. Imagine your own income would be from 1 month or 1 year to the next reduced by 25%. This fact was not recognized for 10 years almost. Instead of adjusting downwards, less competitive Mediterranean economies faced above average rise in prices and income. And that meant that the trade balances developed very unevenly in the north and the south zone, Eurozone, as did the public debt differences in these countries. All this suddenly came up as a great problem after the financial crisis that actually emerged quite in a different place, namely the United States. But the distrust of the financial investors that had been nourished by the American crisis swapped over to the European countries, and there were concerns about the debt carrying capacity of the Mediterranean countries. That is, whether they could really afford such a huge public debt or go bankrupt. With this sudden and brutish need to realign, we have now the crisis in Europe. And what was originally, in a wise action, created as a utilitarian basis was in a sense destroyed by voluntarism that introduced this common currency. What to do now? Exiting the euro, that is returning to national currencies, technically feasible, but would have substantial readjustment costs. And of course, it would kill the European enthusiasm that had emerged in the peaceful 50 years before. It would have sent back Europe to a time where the national prejudices and hostility would come up again. It is not likely that the austerity policy of internal devaluation will really function in democracies. This still needs to be awaited, but I think all the signs show that, in fact, we will not have to expect that it really works. You cannot force a democracy to cut income and prices by 25 to 30%, and that would be necessary in the Mediterranean countries, even in France now. France is the biggest problem in a sense. And if it would not happen, it would exactly result in a retroactive income transfer from the north to the south that was not intended when the European Parliament was created and not given the budgetary authority to make redistribution happen. Okay? So if we look at this situation, we will find that the north and the south of Europe are actually historically quite different. And we had series of devaluations since the Second World War in all Mediterranean countries. These are partly century-old differences in the institutions and mentalities that create the difference. The North is much more a trust society than the South. And if that is not equalized in the one or other way, that is either the North declines or the South is given the transfer, we will see a permanent income transfer from the North to the South. Astonishingly, within the states, income transfers are a matter of course. They happen all the time. The deeper question, therefore, is what is the difference between the national and European unification when it comes to accepting the income transfer? And that is a question of cohesion or solidarity in groups, and that's exactly where the evolutionary perspective can perhaps tell us a little bit more. So I turn to the patterns of human behavior in groups, and I can be very short here because I've already explained much of it. We have an innate tension in our behavior, in our social behavior. On the one side, we have this striving for dominance over others, selfishness, opportunism, and free riding. And it can be argued that these are the parts we have inherited from our primate ancestors who obtained reproductive success in this way and still do. And on the other hand, we have this enormous, significant willingness to cooperate and the readiness to sacrifice own fitness to the benefit of the group. In evolutionary times, fairly recent development. Exactly along this borderline, we see the controversy in biology about individual selection versus group selection. How is cooperation and the sacrifice of own fitness possible without being exploited and ultimately wiped out through free riders in the group? Well, groups of individuals with strong genetic disposition to cooperate have a selection advantage if there is a benefit to cooperation. And second, some way you have to prevent non-cooperative behavior to invade this population. If groups function well and have a reward for doing so. This is a competition between groups. In fact, the second condition is the problem. It is satisfied if cooperation is restrained to individuals with highly similar genetic dispositions. That is in kin selection, and you typically find it in eusocial insects because they share 75% of their genes. However, the hunter-gatherer societies, which we can observe still today and which we take as a proxy for what happened some 30 or 50,000 years ago, they show cooperation in stable groups, fairly small groups, with a relatively low degree of relationship because there is migration between these groups. So the early humans must have been capable of solving the problem in a different way, and in fact they have been able, apparently, to develop emotional ties. All these reactions, smiling, blushing, are emotional reactions. We cannot really control them, or at least we are not very good at controlling them. And based on the ability of social learning and the cognitive capacity we have in face-to-face interactions and our innate tendency in the emotional reaction to punish those who free ride, we have an attitude in small groups, and it is deeply rooted in our behavior still today, supposedly, to overcome this threat of free riding. So group selection problem focuses exactly on how to keep in check the selfishness within the group, how to channel the rivalry within the group into productive forms of competition. A leader who helps everybody else, who is generous, who coordinates the group, say in intergroup conflicts, can be very beneficial. That form of leadership is also accepted. Pro-social dominance is okay in a sense. When the early hunter-gatherers were quite successful in this respect, this may explain some of this enormous selective advantage in the interspecies competition we have enjoyed over the past 50,000 years. The flip side of the coin is that the emotional identification with the own group strengthens the innate shyness and hostility towards non-group members and strangers. Group cohesion, in fact, is probably depending on the rivalry and hostility with other groups, so that hostility and hatred towards outsiders is the midwife in the evolution of group internal solidarity and cooperation. Life in egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups is likely to have shaped a substantial part of our innate social behavior, but this is not necessarily well adapted to later living conditions. And then we are very likely to see further cultural adaptations because the time is too short to see really a large-scale variation at the genetic level, so that it is much more likely, and many of the changes actually happen within even one generation, that they are controlled. Now, the important step on which I want to focus here is the agricultural revolution and the beginning sedentariness about 12,000 years ago that changed the living conditions fundamentally, itself a cultural accomplishment, because the production technology that is in the background here is a cultural accomplishment. It generates population growth because free ranging like in nomadic hunter-gatherers is no longer possible. You have to protect now land and investment, because if you have no protection you wouldn't invest into agriculture. Separate ownership and accumulation emerges as a productive necessity, but the flip side of the coin is that it undermines the egalitarian structure and distribution. So that the power balance now changes significantly. The striving for dominance is less easily channeled into pro-social leadership. The threshold of homogeneous hunter-gatherer groups, smaller than 150, is exceeded, and the formation of blocking coalitions that hinder dominance striving that is not pro-social is increasingly difficult. Dominance becomes increasingly repressive by the emergence of hierarchies, and in a sense the cultural adaptation that now happens is a striving for legitimation of inequality. Because the innate disposition is egalitarian, you have to adapt somehow, reduce the opposition to inequality by making it a social model. And here you have the subordinates and the dominant Chinese Mandarin. None of these subordinates would ever see himself in this place, except perhaps if all the people here revolt against inequality. So there are always historical episodes with revolts and upheavals against inequality, but by and large it was stabilized as a cultural adaptation that inequality is an accepted social model. And if you read religious texts, you often find the glorification of inequality and the justification. And of course you find it in many other forms of, we would nowadays say, ideology of the time. Unfortunately, if these groups grow larger and become suppressive and inequality increases, the emotional ties to the group, and that means also group cohesion, is suffering. So how do you keep these groups intact? This can happen by coercive force and indoctrination. It can happen by charismatic leadership. But it can also happen, and that is a key for understanding our history, by an abstract extension of the emotional ties to the extended group. For instance, by symbols. In almost all paintings of war conflicts in medieval times, you see people running after the flag, which is their sign, emotional tie to their enlarged abstract group. This increases historically with more conflicts on land resources, population growth becomes competitive, warfare starts in a systematic case. Warfare success actually hinges pretty much on the group identification and group cohesion, which can be manipulated by stirring up the antagonism to the enemy and dehumanizing the enemy. And in fact, this is, I think, the key for understanding why warfare was so frequent in Europe, despite the shared cultural values. Wisely, the European unification movement was an attempt to exactly break this hostility and antagonism. The question is whether it's sufficient to bear a European group identity with which we would see redistribution being possible. Thank you.